One of the most important things we need to wrap our heads around when it comes to data modeling is this idea that data can be related to other pieces of data. So think of something like an Airbnb listing, where you have the listing itself, but that listing has many reviews from users. So we have this idea of a relationship between the listing and all of the reviews. So anytime we have a noun in our system, something like listing, something like a review, we can't just model them in isolation, just add their properties and call it a day. We really need to be considering how do these nouns interact with all of the other nouns in the system. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just live off by themselves and they're all hunky dory over there. But most of the time, there's going to be some level of interconnectivity of relationships between all that information. So coming back to quick menu here, we were looking at our menu, and what we have here is actually a series of relationships as well. So we have the menu itself that we were modeling before, and then we have the different sections, which we left as an exercise for y'all, but why don't we go ahead and do that together as well. So first up, we have a section, and then under each section, we have an item. So again, we have nouns. We have these things that we can start modeling within our spreadsheet. So if we come back to our experience here, we've got section. Why don't we go ahead and every section has a name, right? Make sure that's right. Yep, section has a name. And then we'll go ahead and we'll call this a string. And maybe some examples. What about appetizers and mains, right? So that way we can get a flavor for, okay, how is this actually going to be represented? We can go ahead, we'll make a new sheet, and we'll call this one items. And again, that had a name and a price. So name will be string. We talked about this a little bit, but price is different. It is a numeric value. It is a number. And so it's not going to be represented as a string. Sometimes you can, but in our case, we're just going to stick to a numeric value. And again, if we go back to our design here, we can see that in our example of our output of what it looks like when you view a menu, these are whole numbers, they're integers. And so this is a very, very different thing than if we tried to do something with decimals. So it's actually a little bit easier for us to work with. So why don't we go ahead and we'll call this an integer here. So that's a numeric value, that's a whole number. And we can have some examples. So we can say a salad, and that'll be 10. And why don't we go ahead and say something like, oh, chicken wings. And maybe that's $16. Who knows? Maybe we need to introduce the idea of quantity as well. That could be something, but again, we don't need to based on the current designs, but all of a sudden, maybe that's an 8 count versus a 12 count. These sort of things are coming up as we start modeling our data a little bit more. So we can go back to our design here and let's walk through this. So we have this idea of a menu, and then a menu can have many sections, and then a section can have many items inside of it. So these are the relationships that are within the design here that we didn't even probably realize when we were designing this. We were creating this like interconnectivity, but in actuality that we need to represent it. So how do we model this in our database? Well, let's go back to menu here. And we've actually missed a really important attribute that we need to include on every single one of our models. And we'll go ahead, we'll just add a column here to the left, and we'll type it out. And this is going to be our ID. IDs are really, really important when it comes to data modeling. They are unique identifiers for the records within our database table or our schema. And it's something that you see across every database system because it's the way that we can say this thing is this thing. So Nick's Diner, why don't we go ahead and give that an ID of 1? And now Matt's Diner will say it has an ID of 2. So typically, this is a special value, and it's an auto-incrementing unsigned integer, which is a lot to say. For us, why don't we just say unsigned integer? It can be a big int, but that's a whole nother can of worms that deals with the size of the integer. Basically, what we're saying by unsigned is that it can't be negative. We can't have a negative ID. It has to be greater than 0. And by integer, we're just saying whole number. You can't have something with a decimal place. And that is typically what we use to represent our records within the system. But now, even if somebody comes up here to Matt's Diner and updates this, and maybe it's Andrew's Diner now, we always know that it's number 2. So we always have this unique identifier to say, okay, record number 2 has been updated a couple of times, but we always know how to refer to it. And this is really important for things like routing to that record. So if we go back to our design here, if we think a little bit about like what this URL is going to look like, we could have it say quickmenu.com/menu/2 or /3, and that way we know which which menu we want to be presenting here. So that is a really, really important concept that we need to have. It's also how we're going to form our relationships. So let's go back over here, and we'll go ahead and we'll just copy this. So that way we can add it to our sections here. So we'll just go ahead to the left. Oops, not sure what happened there. Oh, we'll go ahead and do that. And then we'll go ahead and do it again one more time. So we'll go to the left and we'll paste in the ID. So now we have IDs for everything. So what if we want to represent the relationships? Well, the way we do that is if we go to our section here and we say, okay, this section is going to belong to the menu. So maybe, well, how do we know one of our menus? We have the ID here. So we can just say, okay, what is the menu ID on the section? So we'll go ahead and we'll add this property here called menu ID. And this will be an ID. We'll just call it that for now. We know it's an unsigned integer, but we'll just say it's an ID. And then for our values, we'll just say 1 for both of these. So now we are modeling that this section belongs to this menu ID. And this is kind of how the whole process works. We can go now, copy this, we'll go to our items, and items will belong to a menu, and that's probably a useful thing for us to model here as well. So all these items belong to this bigger model, but we also need to say that they belong to this section as well. That's how we know they're part of the appetizer section or the main section. So we'll go ahead here and we'll say section ID, and we'll go ahead and say this is ID as well. And maybe this one will be, well, they're both kind of appetizers, but we'll say 1, 2 here. So just to mix it up a little bit more. But now we have these relationships forming. So in database speak or architecture speak, what we're saying is that the menu has many sections, so it's a one-to-many relationship, and then a section has many items. We're also saying that the menu has many items as well. And this is how we start modeling all of these relationships. So look at this design again now with fresh eyes and this new perspective. We thought it was something pretty simple. We've probably made a design like this many, many different times throughout our careers. But in actuality, from a data modeling standpoint, this is fairly complicated. We've got this menu properties here, and then we've got 2 relationships inside of here, each with their own data needs and data modeling concerns. So when we ask our developers, why is this taking so long for you to build? It seems so simple. On the back end, they're doing all this modeling work to make sure that they can access this and keep it really consistently organized so they can work with it. So behind the scenes, this is how relationships are being formed with our data.